First off, I would like to remind whoever is reading this that all of these stories are 100% true and have happened to me personally, so there is no lying here. Also, I don't know why, but I feel almost compelled to tell my experiences, and I hope that someone can relate to them, or at least get a kick out of them. I've had run-ins with skinwalkers on 3 separate occasions. Let me tell you that they are not easy to talk about, let alone write about, because just thinking about them gets me scared again. So I will tell you about the first time I ever saw one, which happened to be the first time I have ever heard of one. First off, a little background about me. I live in Utah, and all the experiences happened while I was still living at home with my parents. I grew up about an hour away outside of Salt Lake City, in farming country, so I was raised on a farm. Growing up, I used to go hunting with my dad and 4 brothers, 4+ times a year, so between hunting, camping, and growing up on a farm, I know my animals pretty well. Now to start the story, it was 7 years ago, late in October. I was 18 years old and my boyfriend, now husband, was 21 years old. For the sake of being private, we will call him Rob. He is half Spanish and half Irish. One thing to know about Rob is that he's a pretty big boy, 6 feet tall, 260 pounds, and a football star. He lived all the way in Salt Lake, but he would still drive up every day to see me after we got off work. He was a real trooper. Well, one night he wasn't feeling too good, so he decided to take off a little bit earlier at 3 a.m. We walked out to my back door, to the front of the house where his car was parked. The moment we walked out the back door, the smell consumed us. It smelled like rotten meat. Rob commented that the country air stunk more than usual. I remember thinking that maybe a cow had died earlier in the day and we just didn't know, but it smelled like it had been decomposing for weeks. When we got back to his car, Rob threw his stuff in quickly and got out to give me one last hug goodbye, when something caught my eye. It looked like a skinny, bony dog that could barely walk. I remember thinking it was a stray and I was gonna shoo it away, but the way its body was shaped made me think it was some sort of coyote, so I kept quiet. It was sniffing around my neighbor's front yard, when all of a sudden it stopped dead in its tracks and stared directly at my boyfriend and I. Now this stare made the hair on my neck and arms stand straight up. It was like it wasn't just looking at me, but studying me almost. When all of a sudden, it stood up on 2 legs and hauled ass into the field behind my neighbor's house. When it stood up, it was very tall and gangly, and when it started to run, you would think it was Usain Bolt. It was so fast, but oddly enough, I never heard its feet hit the ground. I grabbed onto Rob, scared out of my damn mind. I turned to him, but he was still watching it run away in horror. I whispered to him, "What the heck is that?" His face went pale and he replied to me, "Hurry and get your ass back inside your house. Lock the doors, shut your blinds, turn your lights off, and call me." No questions asked, I started to sprint back to the house and back to the backyard door, and when I got inside, I did as he said. I got into my bedroom, which is in the front of the house, top floor. I peeked out my window and Rob's car was already out of sight, so he must have burned some major rubber to get out of sight so quickly. I have never dialed his number so fast. He answered asking if everything was okay and making sure I was fine, and I did everything he said. I again asked him what we had just seen. He told me he didn't want me freaking out, but eventually he gave up and explained to me what it was. It was definitely a skinwalker, he said. He continued to tell me that he knew because he had seen one before. He was well informed on what they were because of his Navajo friend. He was there the night he saw one for the first time. His friend took Rob back to his house and his grandmother. She explained to Rob the Navajo stories behind them, what they were, and she also cautioned both of them not to go near them, don't think about them, and don't talk about them. Needless to say, we were both pretty scared out of our minds and we started to hang out in the city at his house, rather than where I lived because it was such a bad experience. 7 years later, we are married now and living in the city. We don't talk about what happened that night, unless it has to be talked about, and when we do, both of us get pretty frightened. I will post later about my other encounters, and maybe I will convince my husband to let me put his story on here. What do you guys think? Skinwalker? I won't reveal who I am, or much about where I live, and to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened. but I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what we know, and what we don't know. Warning, this is a very long read, and some of the content below is very disturbing, but I can't hold back. Here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know all the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one that we hadn't tried. Now there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit, I have my hangups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in church, you don't let the American flag touch the ground, and you don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway, and since no one else was going, he managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hangups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let your friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him, reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he had ever been on. He had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with, so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends do when they admit they're being asses. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was further away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute didn't know about it, but if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to urinate. I stepped off the road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past a shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees. I saw the first image of the day that I will never forget. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, and brush, but suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least, because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil, and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them had the same uniform white color. As I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shape had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that the circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked in. They were scattered around, as if they had actually been part of a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked in too. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just so long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals share my sentiments, but we were there all day and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started to get really weird. The trail didn't loop at all. so I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd have to walk the 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling in the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started to trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that I was making far too much noise, and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it, but finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of a buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I just didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going further off into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it. At the time, it was funny. "Hey Buck, yeah you, horny motherfucker, leave us alone." He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. "Mark," I called out, but no answer. 5 minutes passed, and I climbed down the ridge after him. "Mark!" I followed in the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far, I knew, because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short while, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. I called out Mark's name again, and I still didn't hear back. I ran forward along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine, with the creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest is bad news. The trail stopped here. "Mark," I murmured, then called out again. "Mark!" Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard rustling, and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself that this wasn't real. At first, I saw a head, the head of a buck, but it came forward and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring at a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared looking, even as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of its body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of an average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized, a mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked, with very human-like genitalia. Its penis was dripping with blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and its legs. They started human, but near the bottom, they started distorting and became animalistic. At the end of its legs were powerful hooves. At the end of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment, there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang, then suddenly, I noticed it was going to jump the gap of the ravine, and that it was coming for me. With the logical side of my brain now shut off, I turned around and ran hopefully in the exact opposite direction the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all my life, but it was still gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm and hungry breath on my back. Its hands were also extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. I took off down the road, hoping that I was going in the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank may have delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason why I can account for how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow, I ran and I ran and I ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore, but I didn't care. I kept on running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe what had just happened. I got into my car, and just before I took off, I shot a glance back at the trail, at the point where it went up between the two mountains, and it was visible from the road. I would regret taking that look. Standing there, near the beginning of the trail, was the Skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it just stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail and didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I needed to tell someone, which is why I am posting it here. It came back to me in my dreams and my nightmares. That creature, the Skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that force was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite, because the image that flashes through my mind the most often is not that horrific creature. It isn't Mark's mutilated and raped corpse, but it's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That odd circle, left alone for so long. I would like to share my experience. I haven't thought about this in a good 10 years since it happened. I'll start at the beginning since I am a storyteller, and I love to share the details. My family moved to rural Pennsylvania when I was 4. I was immediately entranced with living in the country, with several acres of woods right behind us, and the house seemed huge to me at the time. However, as a kid, I was always sensitive to spirits and energy, and there was definitely something creepy going on at my house. My parents noticed that I stayed with our dog, Bambi, a lot. He was a small sheepdog and my adventure buddy when we went walking in the woods. In case you're questioning my parents, they trusted me, as young as age 7, to walk alone, as long as I was with my dog, as he was always very protective of me. My dad would give me his cell phone to carry with me in case I needed any help. Up until I was 15, I spent a lot of time alone by choice. After school, I'd be home by 3:20. I'd eat lunch and immediately take Bambi out to the woods, and we'd explore the surrounding forest, fields, meadows, and ponds together. He was always right by my side, and he seemed really attuned to the spiritual stuff too. For example, if I felt that something was in the house, he'd bark at it or whine at it. I'd watch him follow it around. Usually he'd pick up on the presence of something at the same time I would. Anyway, from my backyard to the left, there was a small strip of trees, and in the fall and the wintertime, when the branches are bare, you can see the field next door, which is about 300 yards from my house itself. There is a big plane shed up there, and a kind of runway, where my neighbor would fly his biplanes off of. What's kind of important to the story is that I have no neighbors for a mile in every direction. It was pretty rare to see any kind of people on the surrounding properties, unless it was my neighbor haying in the fields in the summer. But one day in early fall, I had been tromping through the woods with Bambi for several hours. I let him run off the leash, as I do most of the time, but he would only run ahead about 20 feet, and keep turning around to check that I was still there. If I lost sight of him, he'd retrace his steps and find me again. That day, I got caught up in whittling something, so Bambi ran off a little bit. I suddenly realized I was alone. Suddenly, there was a lot of crashing deeper in the woods, and I heard Bambi's alarm bark. I also heard a lot of yelping and then some screeching. Raccoons and gophers make some really scary distress sounds, so I figured that was it. Alarmed, I called Bambi and he popped out of some brush, covered in pickers, and since I was spooked, I ran back home with him. Right as I got to the back door, I stopped to catch my breath, and Bambi and I were just standing there, when I spotted someone at the very edge of the runway. The runway ran along the higher end of the field, and then there was a steep drop off the edge of the hill at the very end of it. The person didn't appear to be wearing anything distinctive, but even in the dusk, I could see that they appeared completely black, or everything about them was just very shadowy and dark. This is the part that gives me shivers now. The person, or thing, was standing facing off the runway, and then I saw it hunch over, then slowly raise its head and yell, "Bambi!" in the same high voice I would used to call him in. They had the same vocal inflection as me too, but it sounded like they were really trying hard to sound like me. Next to me, Bambi tucked his tail under, lowered his head, and growled softly. They called again, but this time it sounded like they were losing their voice, as if they had been calling for a while. In my 8-year-old logic, I assumed that someone was trying to steal my dog, but why would they stand in the middle of a field and be obvious about it? When I told my parents about it that night, they just dismissed my story. The next day, I went to my cousin's house 2 miles up the road, and my uncle told me about an animal he saw the night before that he was trying to identify. He said it looked like an emaciated cow sprinting across the bridge over the creek, which is about 300 yards from the runway. And also since then, anyone who's been at my house has always been uneasy around the creek, plane shed, and the runway. This is whether or not they're interested at all in the paranormal. I know that a lot of death happens in nature, but I've also found several goats ripped up in the field. I should mention that the nearest house with any amount of goats or farm animals is nearly 4 miles away. There are a lot of unexplained things that have happened over here.